Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I was halfway through cleaning out the junk drawer in my kitchen, one of those tedious, mindless chores you only ever tackle when you're trying not to think about anything important, when my phone started ringing. It was the kind of call that immediately set off a strange feeling in my gut, the kind that sends your brain scrambling before you even pick up. When I saw my mother's name flashing across the screen, I hesitated, already bracing myself for some sort of melodrama. She never called just to chat or ask how I was doing. No, her calls usually came with some heavy-handed guilt trip or thinly veiled criticism wrapped in the tone of maternal concern. But this time, her voice wasn't its usual syrupy mix of control and performance. This time, she sounded frantic, almost breathless, as if she'd been running or crying or both. "Aaron," she said, her voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. "It's Danielle. She's gone. She left the kids." I don't know what to do. I stood there in stunned silence, the sponge still dripping water onto the countertop, my brain struggling to process her words. Gone? What did that even mean? Did she leave town? Did she vanish into thin air? And most importantly, why the hell was I just now hearing about it? Gone where? I asked, already knowing she didn't have a real answer. She didn't say, Mom stammered. She just left. She dropped the kids off this morning and said she had to go. Said she couldn't do it anymore. I thought she was being dramatic again, but then she never came back. I should have felt concern. I should have felt some kind of panic. But all I felt was exhaustion creeping up my spine like a slow, heavy wave. Danielle had a long history of being dramatic, impulsive, and careless with everyone around her. But abandoning her kids? That was a new low, even for her. Before I could get another word out, my mother added, "I'm bringing them to your house." I blinked hard, unsure if I'd heard her right. "You're what?" "They're already in the car." "I can't handle this, Aaron. I'm too old. You don't have children, you have space, and you're responsible. You'll know what to do." "No," I said, sharper than I intended. "No, absolutely not." But it didn't matter. 2 hours later, there she was, standing on my front porch with 3 bewildered children and a suitcase that looked like it had been packed in a panic. Zoe, the oldest, clung to her backpack like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Tyler looked pale and confused, and Ellie, barely old enough to spell her own name, had tear stains drying on her cheeks. "I can't believe you're doing this," I said, arms crossed tightly across my chest as I stood in the doorway, blocking her from pushing the kids inside. "They need you," Mom snapped, her voice rising fast. "They have no one else." "They have you," I replied, my tone cold and flat. "You're their grandmother." "And you're their aunt," she fired back. "And you're the only one who isn't a damn mess. You think I can raise 3 children at my age? You think I can raise 3 children that aren't mine just because you've decided I'm the default adult in this family?" I snapped. "Danielle makes a mess, and suddenly I'm supposed to fix it?" My mother's face twisted into a mask of contempt I hadn't seen in years. "You've always been selfish," she hissed. "Always thinking of yourself. You should be ashamed." "Get off my porch," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "I mean it. Take them home. Figure it out." She didn't move. The kids stood there like little statues, not sure where to look, not sure what to say, their mother gone and now watching their aunt and grandmother argue over who would be stuck with them. I saw the way Zoe's eyes filled with panic, the way Tyler clutched the handle of his tiny roller bag like it was a lifeline. And still, I didn't step aside. "You're a disgrace," Mom said, eyes blazing now. "Your sister's drowning, and you're turning your back on her kids." "She's not drowning," I said quietly. "She jumped off the ship and left them floating." And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I closed the door. Not hard, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any shouting match ever could. I leaned against the other side, my breath shaky, hands trembling from the confrontation. It took everything in me not to crumble right there. After a few minutes, I heard the car drive away. I didn't look out the window. I didn't want to see whether she'd taken them back or left them on my lawn. I just stood there, trying to understand what had just happened, what the hell kind of family dynamic we had spiraled into that this was somehow considered normal. I turned back toward the living room, needing something to distract myself, anything to quiet the noise buzzing in my head. That's when I saw it, Zoe's backpack sitting by the corner of the couch. My stomach sank. Either she'd left it by mistake, or Mom had left it on purpose to guilt me into calling them back. I walked over slowly, hesitant, unsure what I'd find. I unzipped the front pocket, half expecting a doll or a crumpled snack wrapper, but instead, I pulled out a folded sheet of paper with Danielle's handwriting on the front. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a few words scribbled hastily in black ink. I unfolded it and began reading, and instantly, the breath left my lungs. Because whatever this note was, it didn't sound like someone walking away by choice. There's a strange heaviness that settles over you when you've just told your own mother to get off your porch, when you've refused to take in 3 scared children who didn't ask for any of this, and when every instinct in your body is at war with itself. Half of you screaming that you made the right choice, and the other half whispering that you're going to hell for it. I spent the rest of that night pacing the living room, trying to pretend I didn't feel like my chest was caving in from the guilt, trying to silence the voices in my head that sounded suspiciously like my mother's, telling me I was selfish and heartless and cold. I kept replaying the way Zoe had clutched her backpack, how Tyler had looked down at the ground the entire time, how Ellie had just stared blankly ahead, like she'd already checked out of the world around her. I told myself that it wasn't my responsibility. I told myself that I didn't owe anyone anything, not my sister, not my mother, not these kids who barely knew me. But it's not so easy to shut off decades of family conditioning, not when you've been trained since childhood to be the fixer, the mediator, the one who holds the damn ship together when everyone else is too busy setting it on fire. It's funny how quickly you go from being seen as responsible and independent to being labeled cold and ungrateful the moment you stop cleaning up after everyone else. I'd spent years watching Danielle spiral in and out of crisis, watching my mother make excuses for every terrible decision she made, watching them both somehow turn me into the villain anytime I dared to say something wasn't right. I was the difficult one, the judgmental one, the one who couldn't just let things go, all because I didn't pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I guess that's the curse of being the one who sees through the bullshit. People would rather call you cruel than admit the truth. And yet, as much as I tried to push it all away, that guilt sat like a rock in my stomach. I kept thinking about that note I found in Zoe's backpack, the one written in Danielle's frantic handwriting, the one that didn't read like a woman choosing freedom, but like someone running from something much darker. I hadn't told anyone about it yet, not even Uncle Jeff. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if it was a cry for help, a warning, or just another manipulative ploy. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I found myself staring out the window like some suburban ghost, coffee mug in hand, heart pounding every time a car passed by. I hadn't heard from my mother, hadn't heard from Danielle, hadn't heard anything at all, and the silence was louder than any argument we'd ever had. I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing, that I wasn't obligated to sacrifice my life because my sister had flaked out again. But still, that gnawing feeling wouldn't go away. That afternoon, I decided to drive to the local pharmacy just to get out of the house, to do something that didn't involve replaying every painful family moment in my head. As I walked down the aisle looking for toothpaste, I turned a corner and nearly ran straight into Zoe, standing there next to a rack of coloring books, her little face pale and frozen when she saw me. My heart dropped. "Zoe?" I asked, trying not to sound too startled. "Where's your grandmother?" She pointed silently toward the back of the store. I looked toward the pharmacy counter and saw my mother arguing with the cashier, probably about her coupon being expired or some nonsense she thought was worth a scene. I knelt down next to Zoe, trying to think of something comforting to say, something that didn't sound forced. "You doing okay?" I asked gently. She nodded once, then looked away quickly. And then she said something that chilled me to the bone. "Tyler says we shouldn't talk about the man with the tattoo." I stared at her, heartbeat instantly doubling in speed. "What man?" Zoe shook her head. "He said we're not supposed to talk about it or Mom gets mad." Before I could ask anything else, my mother stormed back into view, dragging her purse behind her and snapping at the pharmacist one last time before grabbing Zoe's hand and pulling her toward the door. She didn't even acknowledge me, just muttered something under her breath and walked past as if I were invisible. I stood there, frozen in place, that one phrase echoing in my ears, the man with the tattoo. What the hell did that mean? And why did Zoe look so afraid when she said it? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way Zoe had whispered those words, the way Tyler had avoided eye contact, the way Ellie had barely spoken since arriving. Something wasn't right. Something was deeply wrong, and no matter how much I tried to tell myself it wasn't my problem, it was starting to feel like it might be. And just when I started to drift into sleep, I heard it. Voices outside my window. Kids' voices. Quiet, muffled, but close enough to catch a few words. I told you not to say anything, Tyler hissed. But she saw him, Zoe whispered. She saw what he did. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart pounding like a drum. I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't know what they'd seen. But I knew this much, whatever Danielle had been running from, whatever mess she'd left behind, it hadn't just disappeared. And somehow, without meaning to, I just stepped straight into the middle of it. There's something about guilt that lingers in your skin longer than you want it to. It seeps into your thoughts. No matter how many times you tell yourself you don't owe anyone anything, no matter how many times you replay the reasons why you did what you did. I'd spent the last 48 hours bouncing between anger, confusion, and a sense of unease that I couldn't quite name. Every time I tried to get back to normal, whatever that even meant anymore, I'd remember Zoe's voice, soft and afraid, talking about the man with the tattoo. I'd hear Tyler's whisper through the window that night, and I'd feel that pit in my stomach grow heavier. Something was wrong. Deeply, deeply wrong. And whether I liked it or not, I was already in it. So when Uncle Jeff showed up at my door unannounced that Friday morning, I wasn't surprised. Something about the tension that had wrapped around my life lately made me feel like surprises were going to become a regular thing. He didn't text or call ahead, didn't even knock like a normal person. He just tapped twice, and then pushed the door open like he still had some kind of authority over my personal space. I was still in my robe, cradling a lukewarm mug of coffee, and I almost told him to come back later. But then I saw his face. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just about sleep. He looked worn down in that deep, emotional way people get when they've been holding something heavy for too long and finally decide to put it down. He sat at the kitchen table without asking and motioned for me to sit across from him. I didn't argue. I just sat down and waited for whatever it was he'd come to unload. I didn't tell you everything last time, he said after a long pause. About Danielle. About what she was doing before she disappeared. I didn't say anything. I just raised an eyebrow and waited. Jeff wasn't the kind of man who said things unless he was damn sure they needed to be said. She was scared, he continued. Really scared. I saw it in her eyes every time she came over. She kept checking the windows, asking if anyone had followed her. She was convinced someone was watching her. I felt my heart start to thump a little faster, the same way it had when I first read that note from her, the one that didn't sound like someone who was walking away from her life, but someone being pushed out of it. Did she say who? I asked quietly. He shook his head. No names. Just hints. She mentioned a man a few times. Said he used to be part of her life and now he was back. I thought maybe it was an ex, maybe someone she had a bad breakup with. But then she started hiding things. Money, mostly. She asked me if I had a safe. Wanted to know how much cash I could keep without drawing attention. I stared at him, my coffee forgotten, my mind trying to keep up with the implications. What kind of money? I asked. Jeff shrugged. Stacks of bills. She brought me a grocery bag full of 20s and asked me to hold on to it. Said it was just in case. I thought she was having a breakdown, honestly. But now? I don't know. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the weight of his words. This wasn't just a messy disappearance or another one of Danielle's impulsive decisions. This was something darker, something that had shadows stretching out in directions none of us had seen before. And still, my mother had the audacity to keep calling every relative with a phone number, telling them I was the cold-hearted one for not jumping in to save the day. My cousin Hannah left me a voicemail the night before, saying she hoped I'd find some compassion before it was too late. Compassion, as if that was the missing piece in this nightmare. But my patience was already wearing thin, and hearing that Danielle had been moving money around and whispering about danger made it clear that my mother either didn't know the whole story, or worse, she did and chose not to care because it would interfere with the narrative she was selling to anyone who'd listen. After Jeff left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. My house felt heavier now, like something invisible had settled over it. I walked through the hallway without really thinking and ended up in the pantry, searching for a distraction, maybe a snack, maybe just something to do with my hands. I reached for the cereal box I kept around for when my goddaughter visited, some sugary junk I'd never touch otherwise, and that's when I heard it. A soft rustle, not from the box itself, but from something inside it. I pulled the top open and shook the contents gently, and out came a folded piece of paper, wrapped in a plastic bag like someone had carefully hidden it there on purpose. I felt the chill before I even opened it, like my body already knew whatever was inside wasn't going to be good. The handwriting was unmistakable, Danielle's again, rushed and uneven like she'd written it in a panic. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it and read the first line. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I sat down slowly, the letter clutched in both hands, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. There were no other details, no names, no explanation, just that single sentence hanging in the air like a blade ready to drop. And suddenly, every decision I'd made, every refusal, every attempt to step back from the chaos, it all felt like it was unraveling beneath me. Because this wasn't about guilt anymore. This was something else entirely. And I had this sinking feeling that I was only just beginning to understand what I'd stepped into. You can always tell when a storm is coming, not just by the way the air thickens or how the clouds gather like gossip in the sky, but by that eerie stillness right before everything breaks loose. That's exactly how it felt that morning, quiet, too quiet, like the universe was holding its breath just long enough to slap me in the face again. I should have known my mother wouldn't let things go so easily. She never took no as a final answer. In her world, refusal wasn't a boundary, it was a challenge. And she was never one to back down from a challenge when it came to controlling me. I was upstairs sorting laundry when I heard the shouting. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor arguing with a delivery guy, or maybe one of the teenagers from the next street over playing their music too loud again. But then I heard my name. Loud, sharp, dragged across the air like a knife being pulled through gravel. I froze, laundry basket in hand, my heart already climbing into my throat. When I stepped out onto the landing and looked through the front window, there she was, my mother, standing in the middle of my front lawn, arms flailing, face flushed with fury, yelling loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood and probably half the next one too. "You heartless little brat," she screamed, her voice echoing off the houses. "You're just going to sit up in your perfect little house while your sister's children suffer?" I swear I could see curtains twitching across the street. Lights flickered on as neighbors peeked through blinds, probably hoping this was just some neighborhood squabble and not a full-blown family implosion. I didn't even make it to the front door before she launched into the rest of her tirade. "This is what you've always been. Cold. Ungrateful. Selfish beyond measure," she shouted. "Danielle's missing, and all you care about is your damn pride. You think you're better than everyone, but you're just a disgrace." I opened the door and stood there, arms crossed, trying to stay calm even as my insides burned. "You need to leave," I said as steadily as I could manage. "You're making a scene." Her eyes widened like I'd slapped her, like my measured tone was somehow more insulting than her full-volume circus act. "Oh, I'm making a scene? Well, maybe that's what it takes to get through that thick skull of yours. Maybe if you had a shred of human decency left, you'd stop pretending those kids aren't your responsibility." "They're not my responsibility," I said, louder this time. "And Danielle disappearing doesn't change that. You don't get to drop 3 traumatized children on my doorstep and act like I'm the villain for not signing up to raise them. By then, a few neighbors had actually stepped outside. Mrs. Hanley across the street stood on her porch in her housecoat, pretending to water a plant that had clearly been dead since October. And I saw Marcia, my slightly offbeat but strangely endearing neighbor, standing just beyond the property line with her arms crossed and an unreadable expression on her face. "You're turning the whole family against you," my mother hissed, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel even more cutting. "Everyone's talking about how cold you've become." "I'm not cold," I said, stepping forward. "I'm just done playing the martyr while you rewrite history to make yourself the victim." She didn't have a reply for that. Just one last bitter glare before storming off down the walkway, muttering under her breath the whole way. I stood there for a while, watching her drive away like a dust cloud in a bad Western movie. I was shaking not with regret, but with a strange kind of clarity that felt almost like freedom. But that feeling didn't last long. Later that evening, as I was taking out the trash and trying to clear my head, Marcia wandered over with her usual cup of lukewarm herbal tea and a face that said she'd been waiting for just the right moment to say something nosy. So, she began, stirring her tea with a broken plastic spoon. That was quite the performance today. I almost offered popcorn. I gave her a weak smile. "Yeah, sorry about the noise." "Oh, please," she said, waving me off. "It's the most excitement the streets had since the raccoons knocked over the holiday inflatables." There was a beat of silence, and then she said it casually, like she didn't even realize the weight of the words she was about to drop. "You know, I forgot to tell you. I saw Danielle 2 nights ago." I nearly dropped the trash bag. "What?" "At that little diner off Highway 17, she continued, oblivious to the way my entire body tensed. "She was arguing with some guy out back. Real shady-looking fella, covered in tattoos, yelling about money. I didn't get a good look at his face, but one of the tattoos was this weird snake wrapped around a clock. Hard to forget something like that. My heart was in my throat. "Are you sure it was her?" "Positive," she said. She looked different. Jumpy. Like she was looking over her shoulder the whole time. I thanked her in a daze, trying to keep my voice steady, but my mind was already racing ahead. That tattoo. That diner. That conversation. None of it added up, but somehow it made everything else make more sense. Danielle hadn't vanished, she'd been running. And now I had a location, a thread to pull, something real I could chase instead of sitting in this house waiting for another explosion on my front lawn. The next morning, I drove straight to that diner. The place was quiet, the kind of spot with old coffee stains on the menus and a jukebox that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. I asked the manager about security footage, spun him a vague story about a missing person, flashed a photo of Danielle from a few months ago. He squinted at it, scratched his beard, and eventually said he'd take a look. 10 minutes later, I was staring at a grainy security screen, and there she was, Danielle, clear as day, pacing nervously near the dumpster, talking to a man I'd never seen before. But it wasn't just any man. It was him. The tattoo. Snake wrapped around a clock, just like Marcia described. Danielle looked terrified. He looked angry. I leaned closer, trying to make out their conversation, but the footage had no sound. Just movement. Just fear. And right then, I knew, whatever Danielle had been running from, it hadn't gone away. It had just gotten closer. There's a certain kind of fury that only a mother can summon when she feels like control is slipping through her fingers, and mine had apparently reached the boiling point. It wasn't enough that she had called every relative within a 100-mile radius to poison my name with her sanctimonious version of events. It wasn't enough that I'd been waking up to cryptic voicemails from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, passive-aggressively suggesting I reconsider what family means. It wasn't enough that I couldn't walk into a grocery store without feeling like someone was watching me sideways, wondering if I was really the heartless woman they'd heard about. No, now she had to bring the circus directly to my front lawn and light the whole thing on fire. It was just past noon when I heard the commotion outside, a high-pitched shriek that carried through my windows like a siren. At first, I thought maybe one of the neighborhood kids had wiped out on a skateboard, but then I recognized the voice, the familiar pitch and venom of my mother's wrath in full performance mode. I opened the front door to find her standing dead center in my yard, face flushed, hair wild, waving her arms as if trying to summon a crowd. "You think you're so much better than all of us," she screamed, her voice cracking from the sheer force of it. "You sit in that house pretending you're above this family, but you're nothing but a coward." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, every muscle in my body tense with disbelief and rage. I could already see blinds parting in nearby windows, neighbors poking their heads out to witness the latest installment of Aaron's family meltdown theater. It wouldn't be long before the whispers started again, before I became the woman with the screaming mother on her lawn, the woman who turned away her sister's children, the woman who let her family fall apart while she stood at the center, refusing to catch the pieces. "You're the reason those kids cry themselves to sleep," my mother howled, pointing toward my house as if it were some cursed palace of selfishness. "You're the reason Danielle left in the first place. You and your constant judgment, your arrogance, your goddamn cold heart." I should have gone inside. I should have closed the door and let her scream into the wind. But something about the way she said it, like Danielle's disappearance was somehow my fault, made something inside me snap. "You don't know the first thing about why Danielle left," I said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You just needed someone to blame, and I'm the easiest target because I stopped letting you manipulate me." Her face contorted, eyes wild with a kind of desperation I hadn't seen before. "You've always been a disappointment," she spat. "I should have known you'd never step up when it mattered." "You mean step in to clean up Danielle's mess again?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fury burning inside me. "Because that's what I've always done, right? Covered for her lies, swallowed her chaos, and pretended it was all fine while you looked the other way." "You're a disgrace," she said, her voice low now, like it had dropped into something darker. "You're not part of this family anymore." "Then get off my property," I said coldly, pointing toward the sidewalk. "Because if you keep screaming, I will call the police." She stood there for another moment, shaking with rage, then turned and stormed off without another word. The neighbors returned to their homes one by one, leaving me standing there with a lump in my throat and a bitter taste in my mouth that I couldn't quite shake. Later that evening, after the adrenaline had worn off and the silence in my house had grown thick again, I heard a knock at my back door. It was Marcia, my eccentric but well-meaning neighbor, holding a plate of misshapen cookies and wearing that slightly mischievous look she always had when she had something to say but was trying to pretend it was casual. "I saw the show earlier," she said, handing me the plate. "Hell of a matinee performance." I chuckled in spite of myself. "Yeah, well, I didn't ask for a front row seat." She leaned against the railing, sipping from a chipped mug that smelled vaguely like peppermint schnapps and old tea. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice, "I wasn't gonna mention this, but now I think maybe you need to hear it." I saw Danielle. I blinked. "What do you mean?" "2 nights ago," she said. "Outside that little diner off the highway. I was meeting a friend for a late bite and stepped out back for some air. Danielle was there. She was arguing with some guy, looked like they were in a serious fight. He had tattoos all up his arms. One of them was a snake coiled around a clock, right here on his forearm." My pulse spiked. "You're sure it was her?" "Positive," she said. She looked scared. Real scared. I almost went over, but then they drove off before I could even blink. I didn't sleep much that night. I couldn't. That tattoo, that diner, that fight, it all snapped into place with everything I'd been piecing together. Danielle hadn't run away from her kids because she was overwhelmed. She hadn't vanished because she was reckless. She was running from something or someone, and she'd left a trail behind, whether she meant to or not. The next morning, I drove straight to the diner. I walked in like a woman with a mission, ordered a coffee I didn't plan to drink, and waited for the shift manager to appear. I told him I was looking for someone, showed him a photo of Danielle, spun some half-truth about her being in trouble. He looked at the photo, nodded, and said he remembered her. Said they had cameras out back. Said he'd check. When he came back, he handed me a USB drive and said, "You might want to brace yourself." Back home, I plugged it into my laptop, heart racing, hands trembling. The footage was grainy but clear enough. There she was, Danielle, pacing near the dumpsters, clearly distressed. And there he was too, the man with the snake and clock tattoo, shouting something I couldn't hear, gripping her arm harder than necessary. I paused the video, staring at the frozen frame. That tattoo burned into my mind. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't over. And it was getting dangerously close. There's a particular kind of fury that doesn't boil over in a fit of shouting or explode in a screaming match. It's the kind that settles deep in your chest, cold and deliberate, the kind that sharpens your clarity until it slices through every excuse, every lie, every carefully constructed illusion that people like my mother have spent decades hiding behind. That's the kind of fury I felt when I sat down in my car, laptop still open beside me, replaying the diner footage again and again, memorizing the way Danielle flinched under that man's grip, the way her eyes darted around like a cornered animal. And most of all, the unmistakable tattoo wrapped around his forearm, a snake tangled around the face of a clock, its tongue flicking out toward the minute hand. I didn't know who he was yet, but I knew what he represented: danger, fear, a history I hadn't been allowed to know until it finally spilled out through a grainy security camera. And as I stared at that frozen frame, I realized something that made my hands shake, not with fear, but with certainty. My mother had known. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the full scope of what Danielle had gotten herself tangled up in, but she'd known enough to start a firestorm the moment I refused to play her game. She hadn't just been ignorant or in denial. She'd actively chosen silence, chosen control, chosen image over safety. And now that silence had turned into a ticking bomb, and I was done pretending I didn't hear it. I didn't call ahead. I didn't text. I drove straight to her house, marched up the porch steps, and knocked so hard I thought the glass might crack. When she opened the door, she looked surprised to see me, like she thought I'd finally given up trying to fight. But I wasn't there for peace. I was there for the truth. "I want to talk," I said, brushing past her into the living room before she could play hostess. She followed behind me with that tight-lipped expression she wore whenever she sensed things weren't going to go her way. "Erin, I really don't think this is the cut, the performance," I snapped, setting the laptop down on the coffee table. "Just watch." She stood frozen as the footage played, the silence in the room broken only by the faint hum of the video. I didn't say anything. I just watched her face, waiting for that flicker of recognition, that slight drop in her shoulders, that barely there twitch of her mouth that told me everything I needed to know. And when it came, when her lips pressed into a thin, pale line and her eyes locked on that tattoo like it had been burned into her memory, I knew I'd been right. "You knew," I said, the words coming out flat, heavy. "You knew she was in trouble." She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. "I didn't know the details," she said finally, her voice low. "But yes, I knew there was someone from her past. Someone dangerous. She mentioned him once. Years ago. Said he was gone, that it was over. And you just took her word for it?" I asked, voice rising now. "You didn't press her? You didn't try to protect your grandkids? You just let her keep spiraling while you focused on your damn family image." Her jaw clenched. "She begged me not to get involved. Said it would make things worse. Said if I tried to intervene, he'd hurt someone. So you stayed quiet," I said, stepping back like her words physically repelled me. "And then when she disappeared, you showed up on my lawn screaming like it was my fault." "I was scared," she said, eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't know what else to do." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You knew exactly what to do. You just didn't want to do the hard part. You wanted to hand it to me and walk away clean." I left her house feeling numb, like I'd walked through a dream that had curdled into a nightmare. But I wasn't done yet. There were still too many missing pieces, too many questions that didn't add up, too many threads left dangling. I spent the next few days digging through every trace of Danielle's life I could find, her old journals, receipts, phone bills, even those half-burned notebooks she used to scribble in late at night. And little by little, a pattern started to emerge. Unmarked bank deposits, large cash withdrawals, coded messages, even a few strange notes tucked inside cookbooks and purse linings. Danielle hadn't just been afraid, she'd been preparing. Hiding money, covering tracks, watching her back like she knew something was coming. And then came the name. I found it in an old notebook, scrawled half-legibly in a corner like an afterthought, Vince Seed, followed by a phone number and 2 words circled in red ink, "Do not trust." A few calls later, and I found out exactly who Vince C. was: a low-level enforcer with a history of extortion, once linked to a string of money laundering fronts in 3 counties. His name had come up in a federal investigation 2 years earlier, but the case had gone cold. No witnesses, no leads, and no one willing to talk. Danielle had dated him briefly, something no one in the family ever mentioned, probably because it didn't fit into the story my mother liked to tell at dinner parties. He'd disappeared for a while, but apparently he hadn't stayed gone. He'd come back, and Danielle had been running ever since. That night, still wired with adrenaline and fear, I went through the last of Danielle's things that had been left in the kids' bags. And inside one of Zoe's storybooks, tucked between the pages like a forgotten bookmark, I found a final note, her handwriting again, desperate and rushed, just like before. "If Mom tries to take the kids again, don't let her." I sat there, holding the paper, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Because in those few words, everything shifted again. There was something my mother wasn't telling me, something bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than I'd imagined. And whatever it was, Danielle had known the truth. And now, so did I. There's a strange stillness that follows chaos, not the peaceful kind that brings clarity or comfort, but the kind that wraps itself around you like a heavy wool blanket soaked in cold water. It was that kind of stillness I found myself drifting through in the days after everything came crashing down, after the arguments, the discoveries, the broken illusions, and the final gut punch of finding Danielle's warning tucked inside one of Zoe's books. I moved through my house like a ghost, not because I didn't know what to do next, but because I knew exactly what needed to be done, and it was going to shatter what little was left of the family I'd spent my entire life trying to hold together. The next morning, I called Child Services. I didn't flinch. I didn't second-guess myself. I didn't reach for my mother's voice in the back of my mind begging me to protect the family's reputation, to keep our business behind closed doors. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd read. And most of all, I knew those kids deserved more than to be passed around like emotional baggage by adults too damaged or dishonest to admit they were in over their heads. I gave the caseworker everything I had, every note, every piece of information, every scrap of evidence I could find that pointed to the truth behind Danielle's disappearance and the danger she'd been running from. The kids were placed with a vetted foster family that same week, people who were trained, who had the resources and stability I couldn't offer, no matter how much my heart wanted to keep them safe. That was the hardest part, handing them over. Watching Zoe, Tyler, and Ellie climb into that car with their small bags and frightened eyes, unsure if this was just another chapter of abandonment or something better. I hugged them all, told them they were brave, told them they were going to be okay, and tried not to cry until the car pulled out of my driveway. It wasn't until I closed the door behind me that the sob broke free, loud and raw and long overdue. A few days later, my mother showed up again, but this time she didn't come shouting. She came in quietly, almost timid, her face pale and drawn, her voice soft in a way that felt unfamiliar and fragile. She sat at my kitchen table without invitation, hands trembling, eyes rimmed with tears she didn't try to hide. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of it. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know it would get so bad." I didn't say anything at first. I just sat across from her, watching the way her mouth quivered, the way her hands clenched and unclenched like she was trying to find something solid to hold on to. "You always knew more than you admitted," I said eventually. "You may not have known everything, but you knew enough. You knew Danielle wasn't safe, and you knew those kids were scared. You just didn't want to deal with the consequences." She didn't deny it. She didn't make excuses. She just cried, small quiet tears that soaked into the collar of her blouse as she sat hunched over, finally realizing that the version of control she'd clung to had shattered beyond repair. "I thought I was protecting the family," she said weakly. "No," I replied, standing up from the table. You were protecting your idea of family. And there's a difference. She asked me for forgiveness, but I didn't have it in me to give. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some wounds don't heal just because someone says they're sorry. Some betrayals can't be bandaged over with tearful apologies and trembling hands. I didn't scream at her. I didn't throw her out. I simply walked to the door, opened it, and waited until she stepped outside. That was the last time I saw her. In the weeks that followed, things started to settle. I went back to work. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected while dealing with the family fallout. I slept better, though not always peacefully, and I tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy, even if it felt like walking through a life that wasn't fully mine anymore. The kids were doing better. According to their caseworker, Zoe had started speaking more, Tyler was drawing again, and Ellie had begun sleeping through the night without screaming. They were healing in the way that only children can, slowly, clumsily, but beautifully. And then, just as I thought the dust was finally beginning to settle, a letter arrived. No return address, just my name scrawled in uneven handwriting on the front of a plain white envelope. I stood in the doorway holding it for a long time before opening it, already knowing who it was from before I saw the first word. It was from Danielle. Postmarked from some tiny, unfamiliar town across the country, a place so remote it barely registered on Google Maps. The letter wasn't long, just a few pages, the ink smudged in places, the words rushed and uneven. She apologized, not for leaving the kids, not for the chaos, but for leaving me in the middle of it. She said she never wanted me to get pulled in, that she'd tried to keep me out of it for my own protection. She said she'd made mistakes, but she'd done what she could to keep her children away from a life she'd barely escaped herself. But it was the last line that knocked the wind out of me. It wasn't just him, Aaron. Mom knew more than she ever told you. I read that line over and over again, my hands trembling, my throat tightening with something that felt like grief, like betrayal, like rage wrapped in heartbreak. I stared at the words long after the ink had blurred from my fingers, touching it too many times. I didn't know what to do with that sentence, what it meant in the grand scheme of things, what secrets still lay buried beneath all the ones I'd already unearthed. But I knew this. There was still more to this story, and I wasn't done digging yet.